Hello, friends. How are you all? I hope you are doing great and taking care of yourself. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. In today's video, we are going to talk about important concept called Oracle SQL data types. Even before we start writing our different SQL statements like DDL statements, DML statements, DQL statements, knowing these different data types will help you to define the kind of data that can be stored in the column. At the same time, the right data type will help us with the data integrity, efficiency storage, and the faster querying. So, what exactly are data types in SQL and why they are so important? We are going to talk about all these in today's video. In Oracle SQL, there are several types of data that can be stored like numbers, dates, characters, and as you can see on the screen, we are having numeric data type, character data type, then we have lob data type, and etc. So we are going to basically take a closer look on each of these data types with the help of examples, and by the end of this video you will get an understanding of the correct data type which can be used to define your data in the column, and at the same time it will help you to take the decisions when you're designing your database schema. So without much further delay, let's get started. So friends, let's quickly look what data types are available in Oracle before we start getting into the deeper of each of these data types. As you can see on screen, the first data type is the numeric data types, which helps us to store the number, integer, float in against the column. The second one is the character data type, where you can store the characters, which is none other than our text. The third one is date and time data types, where you can store the dates, the timestamps, etc. The fourth one is the lob data type, where you can store the binary data and the character data. And there are other data types, which is row ID, which is nothing but a unique identifier to identify the rows stored in the table. The second one is UR row ID, which is none other than similar to the row ID, but this is specific to the object type. The last one is the XML type. As the name suggests, it is used to store the XML data against the column where we have defined it has the XML data type. So now, without much further delay, let's take a deeper dive into each of these data types. So let's get into that. So friends, let's quickly take a deep dive into different data types in Oracle SQL. But before that, let's just have the theoretical definition of the data type. So what is data type? To define the type of data that can be stored in a column of database table. Why we need data types? To ensure that the data is stored efficiently and the correct. How to choose the correct data type? So it involves lot of factors to be considered before you choose the correct data type, like the type of data you want to store, the size of the data, and the need of that data. So here we go with our first data type, which is the numeric data type. So what is this numeric data type? This data type is used to store numeric values, among which the number is most commonly used, which is used to store the integers and the floating numbers. So with a numeric data type, you have something called as a precision and the scale. So when I talk about that, as you see in the example, we have defined a column having number 4 comma 2. What that means is this column can store the 4 digits. Out of that, the 2 are the decimal. So the numbers can be stored like 10.20, 99.99, 89.99, 70.99, etc. against that column in the database. So now what is different between the numbers and I would say the floating or the integer numbers? So integer is nothing but a whole number. For an example, let's go back with our classic example of a library book where I am defining a table called as books, and in that I have defined a column called as a book ID. Now the book ID can't be with a decimal. It is a uh, whole number. So I will define that column uh, has the integer, and it can be it can store now 101, 201, 500, 1000, etc. So that's what makes difference between the number, integer, or a float. Now I have to store the price of that book, and the price can be a decimal, right? It can be 9.99 dollars, or it can be $99.99, or it can be $200.89, right? So I will define that price column as a float, as you can see on the screen. Now let's talk about important another important data type, which is a character data type. So as the name suggests, it is used to store the characters, which is nothing but a text, right? And there are a lot of different character data types. So first one is the character, second one is the varchar true, nchar, nvchar, clob, and clob long, etc. But the most common in the real time, or I would say the real scenarios where when we create the database is use the char or the varchar. So what is difference between this char and the vchar? That would be a question in your mind. So v in the vchar stands for the variable. So that means the size can be changed, right, anytime, right? But we will define we care for an example to store the 10 characters, but when you're inserting or inserting a data into it, it can be of 5 characters, it can be of 6 characters, so it will occupy only that 6 characters, right, of the space in the memory. Even though we have defined the varchar 2 as 10, and that's where makes it different from the character, where once you define the character, it will store that fixed length of data in it, and it will occupy that much space, even though if you're storing a data less than what you have defined, but the memory would be allocated for that. So in if you see on the screen, we have an example where I've defined the countries as one of the table, and in that it has the country ID cat 3, where the country code is 3 characters long. Now the country code can be 2. So for an example, I define a country ID has ny. So now the data in the column is ny, which is 2 characters, but in the memory we have already 3 characters of space occupied, right? And that makes different from the varchar 2, as the name suggests, variable, right? So if you see in the example, we have defined a table called as author, and in that we have an author ID and we have an author name. The variable length string with max of 50 characters. So that's how. And if you see, when I'm inserting a data into it, I am inserting the author name has Chetan, and now it will only consume 6 characters of space. That makes it very useful when we are defining our database to make a use of real time cases, right? So that's the difference between a character and the varchar. So knowing the type of the data, the size of the data, and the need of data, it's important for us to define the correct data type. So now let's quickly look into the date and the time data types. So friends, now let's take a deeper dive into the data and the time, sorry, the date and the timestamp data type. So what are these? So whenever you want to store the date or the time, you define a data type called as date, which will store the day, month, and the year. It will also store hour, minute, seconds. So now going back to our classic example of library having the books, um, or a book of library, right? So I've created a table called as books where it has a book id, book name, and the published date. So now I want to store the data of the book where it has a book id, it has the book name, and it has the date, which when was that book published. So I have basically defined that, and if you see, I've used something called as a to date function because I want to store that data, a published date, in a particular format like YYMMDD. Tomorrow, if you want to store DDMMYY, you can absolutely store that. But for an example, to show you a demo or to get an understanding of it, I have used YYMMDD. Now, second is the timestamp, which helps you to store the time up to seconds and milliseconds also. So that's where it is very important to take into consideration what kind of data you are storing and what data type should I define for that column. So in this case, I have created a table called as an event log, and I want to capture when was the user logged in, when the user logged out, when he has for an example taken a break or went for somewhere and the system was locked for xyz hours, right? So that's where I have defined a column called has an event type, and it has a timestamp data type against it. And if you can see in our example, we are storing milliseconds or a fraction seconds. So 8 o'clock, 8:30, 45 seconds, 1 2 3 milliseconds. Now let's talk about something called as a raw data type, where it is used to basically store the binary data, and this data can be encrypted data, it can be a checksum data, any non-character data. So now we have defined a table called as a file, and in that file table I'm storing a file id, file name, and the checksum, where it has a data type called as a raw, and it has a variable length of 16 characters or a 16 byte, whatever you call it. So that's what I am storing. Now the last one is the large object data type. So if you have been already working with the data types, with the database where you want to store the XML data type, and that's where this large object data type comes. The real example of that can be if you want to store the audio files or the documents in your database. You basically can use blob, you can use clob, you can use xml type, etc, right? So that's what is it, right? So other data types we have discussed is the row id, row xml type, ur row id. I hope you got an understanding of what we have covered in today's video before we jump into the practical session of writing the DDL statements, DQL statements, DML statements. If you think this video has helped you to brush up your skills specifically for the Oracle data types, then do not forget it to hit the like button, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and hit that bell icon to get notified whenever I upload the next video for our SQL journey for beginners. Until then, take care. Bye bye.